Good day, everyone. It's Alan Shimel, DevOps.com, and we're here for another DevOps.com webinar. Though, truth be told, this is actually more of a video presentation than a traditional webinar. But nevertheless, I am glad you're able to join us, and I hope you will find today's discussion very interesting. The title of today's webinar is GDPR getting ready to give your company the left hook? Meaning, and it's a great little graphic there of the left hook. But before we jump in, let me introduce you, actually even before I introduce you to Jeff, real quickly, we use the GoToWebinar system for today. And if you have any questions, I would like you to use the question section of your GoToWebinar control panel, which for most of you is probably in the top right-hand corner of your screen. And you can see there's a question section. If you expand it, clicking on the arrow, make it face downwards, you can ask your questions. We are going to do questions in real time, so don't wait till the end. Pop your questions in as you get them, and we'll work them into our conversation today. What's nice about it is we'll keep a record of these questions so that we can be sure to get everyone the answers they need. If you're having any technical difficulties, maybe the video's not working for you, the audio is chopped or something, we do ask that you use our chat section, which is down in the bottom, where we do have people standing by who will try to help you if you have any issues around, or well, we'll try to help you the best we can if you have any technical issues. So please use chat for technical issues, use the question sections for questions. With that being said, let's jump in here. As I mentioned, is GDPR getting ready to give your company the left hook? It's going to be a great discussion for both our DevOps.com audience as well as our Security Boulevard audience. And today's discussion is sponsored and brought to us by our friends at CA Technologies. Let me introduce you to our panel today. The easier one will be, I guess, me. I'm Alan Shimel, editor-in-chief of DevOps.com and Security Boulevard. And, you know, I've had about 20 years in the information security space, excuse me, as well as the last 4 or 5 years really in DevOps, DevSecOps. Joining me today, though, much more interesting, is Jeff Hughes. Jeff is the Principal Product Marketing Manager, Test Data Manager for CA. Jeff, welcome.
Thank you very much, Alan. It's a pleasure to be here.
Jeff, before we go further, I wanted to apologize. I'm just getting over the flu, so if you hear me coughing and sniffling a lot, that's what it is. I'm not contagious, and I'm in a room by myself, so apologize. Jeff, why don't you give our audience, though, a little bit of background on how you come to be where you are today?
Sure. Well, welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and spend a little bit of time with you talking about GDPR. I have been in technology for about 25 years. I've worked for various high-tech companies in networking, software security for about 10 years. Most recently, I have been here at CA Technologies, working in the software continuous delivery, continuous testing group. We sell tools that allow you to test your products, test your applications, and achieve that agile development process that we're all trying to get to. I am an avid writer. I've written a number of books over the years and have written lots of white papers and lots of content. I thrive on being able to write that, and especially I like being able to take complex topics and make them easy to understand. We all want simplicity, and so that's one of the areas that I enjoy and excel in. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Alan.
Thank you. So Jeff, let's dive right in here on GDPR GDPR, and I think the place to start with it is kind of high level. In a nutshell, what is GDPR?
Yeah, so GDPR stands for the General Data Protection Regulation. It is a regulation that was implemented. There was a directive initiated in 2012 out of the EU, and it's primarily focused around protection of user data and data privacy. More recently, about 2 years ago, the EU decided that they were going to make the GDPR law, and that law becomes effective here in May 25th of 2018. It is significant in that it is broad in terms of its scope and its reach, impacting any company that maintains or accesses or uses EU citizens' data. So companies in North America or any other part of the world that are acting or using data from EU citizens, either storing it or interacting with that data, are subject to this new regulation. So from a high level, it is a broad-reaching regulation focused on data privacy for EU citizens.
Okay. Fair. That's a mouthful. But, a couple of key things I just want to call out to the audience. Number one, you mentioned the effective date, which I believe was May 23rd or May 25th?
May 25th, 2018.
Yep, so it's May 25th, 2018. So we're still about 4 or 5 months out from the day it goes into full force and effect. But, truthfully, the EU gave plenty of notice around this. I mean, it's been known about for a long time now. Number two is a lot of the initial, I think, Jeff, that I've heard the initial reaction from some folks is, well, look, I'm not based in the EU. As a matter of fact, I don't really do any direct business in any of the EU countries. So this is a non-event for me, right? Or do I have to worry about this? And of course, Jeff, that's not true, right?
Right. So people may have that perception that because they are not in the EU or doing business, or they think they're not doing business in the EU, that this regulation may not impact them. The fact of the matter is that many companies are transacting business. They have customers that are in their databases that are using, and they're storing EU citizens' data in those databases. And so the regulation impacts anybody, not just in the EU. It's any company that's storing or transacting or using EU citizens' data. I think you would be hard-pressed to find very many companies that don't have some EU citizens' data, since we are so globally interconnected as companies, and certainly the large multinational companies are well aware of GDPR. You get down into the more medium-sized or smaller types of companies, and they may not be aware of the impact of GDPR. It is, again, a regulation that all of us need to take a look at to make sure that we are set up for compliance. And you're right, the EU gave us notice, easily 2 years ago, telling us to prepare for this regulation. I think in North America, companies have been a little slower to react to that. Most recently, I would say in the past 6 to 8 months, our company, we've seen an uptick in interest around GDPR and how do we get prepared for GDPR and what do we do around that regulation.
Fair enough. And Jeff, first question from the audience is from Peter, and he wants to know if that was still relevant for the UK. And, my answer there, Jeff, two things. First of all, though Brexit is real and they're negotiating and all of that stuff, as we speak here today, the UK is still part of EU and will be
Oh yeah.
on May 25th in all likelihood, unless something crazy would have blow up. So number one, the UK will be part of the EU May 25th, and therefore it is binding on UK companies. Number two, though,
Absolutely.
yeah, number two, even if they weren't, more so in the UK than perhaps here in the US, there's so much business going across the borders here, right? Between, let's say, UK and France, or UK and Germany, and UK with any of the other EU partners, that to think the UK is somehow going to exist in a vacuum, separate and apart from, and not do business with EU countries, is probably unrealistic. So I would say it is relevant today and will be relevant going forward for UK companies.
Yeah, yeah, and the thing is, a lot of people have raised that question, about Brexit, and thinking that, Great Britain won't be subject to the regulation because they're no longer in the European Union. You're absolutely right, Alan. First of all, it hasn't happened yet, and also, even if it did happen, even if they were not in the European Union, the regulation still applies to Great Britain. Regulators in Great Britain were partially responsible for drafting the legislation. As a European Union body, they enacted, enabled, voted on this legislation, and the European Union Authority intends to enforce that regulation regardless of what country is involved. The bottom line is that if you're in violation, if you're not protecting EU citizens' data, then you're liable to get caught up in the regulation. So you're absolutely right. Brexit is not an excuse for avoiding GDPR.
Yep, and just not to belabor the point, but I want to add that Jane Moss, one of our attendees, chimed in here, Jeff, that the UK government has indicated it will implement an equivalent alternative legal mechanism to replace GDPR post-Brexit. Support provided to the creation of GDPR by the ICO and UK government as an effective privacy standard, together with the fact that the GDPR provides a clear baseline against which UK businesses can see continued access to EU digital market. And it illustrates that, the UK is going to mirror GDPR legislation. So, anyone looking for a way out of GDPR by somehow, going to the UK, that's not going to happen.
Right.
Before we move on, we have another question from Jonas around data from U.S. citizens that are stored in your European servers. But I'd like to come back to that in a moment, Jeff, because that, I think, begs the larger question, which is the next one I wanted to hit. But first, let me say this. In this, as a security person, I've been dealing with compliance for 15 years. It was Sarbanes-Oxley, SOX, Gramm-Leach-Bliley, if you remember, Jeff, Gramm-Leach-Bliley data protection, the PCIs, the HIPAAs, the red flags, all of these things. Security compliance is not a new issue. What I've always tried to tell people is, generally speaking, compliance, these types of compliance schemas, represent what I call lowest common denominator security. They're not the be all and end all. They're the beginning. At a bare minimum, you should do this. So, I always advise my clients. I had a company, the CISO group, before I launched DevOps.com, where we would do security consulting. I'd advise clients that if you're doing security right, if you're minding your P's and Q's and following best practices of security, compliance almost takes care of itself. And I think that's even with GDPR, though I will say GDPR might be a higher bar than some of the some of the dreck we've seen in the past.
Yeah.
It's still based on best practices of security.
Yes, and you raise a very good point, because GDPR, like any of these compliance regulations, is just the starting point. So for a lot of companies to be PCI compliant or HIPAA compliant or GLBA, whatever the regulation is, that's just the basic level of security that needs to be implemented. Hopefully companies have much higher standards than that. So I've heard some companies say, GDPR, it's another regulation that we have to deal with. However, if you look at it as an opportunity to check your level of security, check how you're doing with data privacy, it's an opportunity to become compliant or strengthen your security stance around these various initiatives. Now, what's different about GDPR is that it's broader in the sense of providing user protections, end user protections for the consumer. And so it's broad in the sense that GDPR says, hey, as a consumer, I have certain rights about how you use my data, how you protect it, and so on. Now, we've had notable breaches recently, Experian and Yahoo and others, Deloitte, for example, where companies, again, need to constantly be taking a look at how they are protecting consumer data. So GDPR expands the definition of what data is considered, what consumer data is considered private, and they also have upped the ante in terms of enforcement and the fines that are associated with it. And so companies do need to raise the bar in terms of how they're handling the protection of consumer data.
Absolutely. And so, Jeff, let us now turn to sort of what are some of the differences between data privacy in the U.S., data privacy in the EU? And part and parcel with that, Jeff, is, in the U.S. we do have Sarbanes-Oxley, we do have HIPAA, red flag. PCI is the worldwide standard. It knows no borders, right? Any place that's using payment cards. What are some of these key differences?
Well, that's a very good question, because compliance is interesting. One country will come up with a regulation and then another country will follow suit. And so, like you said, in the United States, some regulations were enacted, and then Europe and other countries will follow in enacting their own similar types of regulations. So we might expect something similar to be enacted in the United States, similar to GDPR. We'll see how that unfolds over the next, couple of years. But to answer your question, what are some of the differences between privacy here and privacy in the EU? A couple of notable things that I would point out. First of all, privacy laws in the U.S. can change with each administration. Okay, so as each new administration comes into office, some of those privacy laws are changed and tweaked and so on with each changing presidency. Privacy laws in the EU do not change that frequently, so that's one difference. We also know that in the U.S. we have very little ownership currently of our individual data. GDPR changes that level of ownership in the EU. So the EU citizens are now going to have a lot more control about how companies use their personal data versus here in the U.S. Okay. A couple other differences. Privacy laws in the U.S. are kind of a messy combination of different laws. You mentioned PCI. PCI really is enforced by banks. Banks want to protect financial assets, and so they have come together in a consortium to create PCI. HIPAA is healthcare, obviously, and that's enforced by different regulatory bodies. And then GLBA will be enforced, of course, in the European Union by a single authority. So here in the United States, it's fragmented in terms of enforcement. The EU is much more organized in terms of how they will enforce that, that regulation, GDPR. So those are some of the differences between data privacy here in the United States and over in European countries. I expect over time, though, that they'll start to become more even as it relates to data privacy.
Excellent point, Jeff. That was actually a great answer. You had so much information in there. I want to, excuse me. I want to call out two specific concepts that you talked about, though, because I really do think people need to focus on that. The first one you mentioned was the idea of ownership of your information, right? I went to law school before I got into computers, and there's an old case of Bela Lugosi, the estate of Bela Lugosi, whether they owned his image after he died, right? And it's a classic law school kind of moot court case. It's almost the same thing now with, do you own your own personal information? And in the U.S., clearly we don't, right? You can give your personal information away, and once it's given away, right, on a state-by-state basis, sometimes they got to notify you if there's a breach containing your information. But other than that, you really don't have an ownership right in that information. Where in the EU, it appears they're creating, or they've codified the idea of you have almost like an IP, an intellectual property right to your personal information. And that, fundamentally as an individual, you have a right to how your personal information is used, who it's given to, and everything else. And that's going to have profound impact, right? I mean, you're creating a right with people. And anytime you do that, it's going to, right? I mean, that's really, really important.
Yeah.
The second thing, go ahead, Jeff.
Well, let me just share two thoughts there on that. Let me just expound on that a little bit. This idea, so there's a couple of elements to GDPR that are significant based on data privacy. The idea of what is considered confidential information is being expanded in GDPR. So in the United States, it might be a name, an email address, your address, maybe, social security number and those types of things. But GDPR is expanding that definition. It could be an IP address that's associated with you. It could be your race. It could be your religion. All of those things are broadening to provide a bigger definition of what's considered personal information. Now, GDPR states that you have to provide explicit consent. There's this concept of explicit consent to use customer data, okay? And so even in development environments where you're using production data for testing, for example, you're going to have explicit consent. That means that when somebody is, a consumer is signing up for a service or buying a product, they're going to have to check specific boxes. I am going to let you use my data for marketing purposes. I'm going to let you use my data for testing. I'm going to not let you use my data for third-party services or advertising. So companies are going to have to get very, very specific about what is consent and what is not. So that's one thing I wanted to point out. The other is that consumers under GDPR will have the right to be forgotten. So that means that if I don't want you to know me or remember me or use my data, you have to comply. You have to delete my name and my information and not use it for any purpose. So anyway, I just wanted to expound on those couple of
No,
points.
no, you're 100% right. That, and Jeff, that brings up we had a few questions from the audience already on this, and that is this concept of removing one's data. Erase me from your database. The ultimate do not call list. And this is going to be something that is new, I think, for people. For companies who deal in data like this, which is the idea of this person's requested to be removed, and he has to be removed. And if you've shared it with anyone, it has to be removed down the line.
Yes,
that could create a real kind of nightmare, in terms of how do you do that? So that's that. The second big picture item you hit in that terrific answer earlier, Jeff, was the idea of where in the EU they've now taken the step to deal with this holistically, organically in one GDPR, in one act that deals with it. Where in the US we are a bit of a hodgepodge. You have various states, data protection, privacy. You have private industry like the PCI data, the bank card stuff. You have HIPAA, which deals specifically with healthcare data. We have this spider web, if you will, and it's hard, right? Because there's all different levels, different things that apply to different industries, different types of data, different, what state you're in and stuff like that. It's really fundamentally almost, the US way versus kind of the EU way of AC versus DC. But ultimately the world is becoming too small, I think, for us to continue having a hodgepodge, and data privacy is too important to have a hodgepodge. Whether you want to say the EU is fundamentally, laying down the path that we all must follow. But I mean, it seems to be taking the lead in bringing this all together. We had a couple of questions. Jeff, I just wanted to bring this home by a couple of questions people asked, which was, look, does it make a difference if we store the EU person's data in a US-based server versus an EU-based server? I don't think so.
No, it does not. The law is far-reaching in that if the data is stored, a lot of companies, you could take Apple or any large multinational corporation. They're going to have databases where they're storing EU citizens' data, both here in North America and obviously over in EU. Their strategy might be for consolidation or simplification or better control of the data is to make sure that the EU citizens' data is stored in one location. And that might be preferable to have that data stored on servers in the EU. However, it doesn't matter where that citizens' data is. If you're a smaller company, a medium-sized company, and you have customers that have purchased products or services and they have entered information into your databases and that data is stored here in North America, you're subject to GDPR. You're subject to protect EU citizens' data regardless of where that data resides.
Yep. Jeff, let us move on because we've got a lot to cover. The next area I wanted to talk about was, how are companies, whether they're EU-based, US-based, whatever, how are companies going to need to structure their communications with end users when discussing their personal data? I mean, this whole idea of dealing with it.
Yeah, so like I mentioned earlier, this concept of consent is going to play a very big role in terms of how companies manage consumer data. So going forward, companies are going to have to provide screens and capability on their websites and so on as they interact with customers, requesting explicit consent. It's no longer going to be acceptable for companies to say, well, they didn't opt out. Okay, it's now required that they specifically have to consent to you using their information in whatever capacity you intend to use that data. Coming from a development and a testing background, this is significant for companies that use production data when they do testing, and that's most companies. They'll pull in production data, they'll mask it, and then they'll go ahead and do testing. Now, if an EU citizen says, hey, I don't want you using my data, I don't want you, even in testing, I don't want my data used or obfuscated or any of those kinds of things through masking and so on, then it's going to require companies to pull that data, that consumer data out of those lists and not use it for testing. So consent is really a big area where companies are going to have to change, becoming much more explicit in terms of how they ask consumers and verify that they indeed have permission to use that customer data. That's the biggest issue right there.
Sure.
Okay.
Excellent point. Jeff, let me ask you another one that comes out of Peter from our audience asked a question, but I'm going to take his question and turn it a bit, if you will. And that is sort of the don't ask, don't tell theory of personal data, which is, look, I'm not going to ask what country you're from. So I don't know what country you're from. And therefore, since I don't know what country you're from, I don't have to worry about complying and giving you your rights as an EU citizen, let's say, because after all, I don't know what country you're from. I didn't ask that. Is that a way to duck out from under this?
Well, I mean, the answer is no. Of course not. You know, dealing with consumer data, just ask Yahoo or Experian or any of these companies that have experienced big breaches. Dealing with consumer data is job number one. It's a high priority, and so trying to get around the regulation or duck out is not going to work. Now, to say that, hey, I'm not going to get caught, I can just continue what I'm doing because I'm a small company, I think eventually the regulations will catch up to you, and for a number of reasons. One is that GDPR, they will be able to enforce GDPR across the ocean here in North America. They will do that through legal and legislative efforts here in the United States that are ongoing right now, where they're working with U.S. authorities in terms of how they're going to levy fines and prosecute and so on. We know that the EU has a lot of power in terms of mergers and acquisitions and how they manage the affairs of multinational companies. I mean, they fined Apple and they fined Google and so on. They have a lot of power in terms of what they can do. So we will need to comply, and companies and customers will need to comply. The other point I want to make is that other companies may say, hey, are you GDPR compliant, or we're not going to do business with you. So there will be this situation where vendors who are doing business with other vendors will want to ensure that there is compliance around these regulations. So over time, we will be coerced or pushed into a situation where we will have to comply with the regulation.
Fair. Good. Jeff, let me go broach another subject with you, and that is, you know, when we look at, let's say, PCI, for instance, right? Mm-hmm. PCI spawned the whole cottage industry of you know, PCI certified assessors, of you know, just PCI compliance tools. There was this whole ecosystem built around, you know, I mean, large companies raised venture money just around getting level 4 merchants to fill out their you know, their PCI compliance format.
Yeah, their audit form, right?
Yeah, you know, all of that stuff, and their SAQs, as they're called. Do you think we're going to see a similar kind of thing where we're going to have an ecosystem around GDPR? Tools and certifications and assessors and auditors and so forth.
Yes, I think that's already started. It's been ongoing. There's a lot of companies that provide various tools for GDPR. Let me say this, that If you're looking for a push button tool, one button that's going to make you GDPR compliant, that solution does not exist. Not even from CA. From a testing perspective, we sell a product called Test Data Manager, for example, and within that tool you can do data discovery and profiling for compliance. And so naturally, we're interested in talking to customers with GDPR or basically any compliance, helping them to locate where their PII data exists so that they can start down this path of being more compliant. So companies are coming out with tools to assist in the process of GDPR. There are consulting groups that are pushing services associated with GDPR to help companies become compliant. So that cottage industry has already started. It's been going for a couple of years, and we'll continue to see that. Just because the regulation is enforceable May 25th doesn't mean that all consulting will stop at that point. It'll be ongoing for many, many years to come. But yes, there's a lot of companies out there that are willing to assist. I would say the first thing, if you're looking at, how do we get started with GDPR, the first thing you need to do is identify where your PII data exists. That's really the first step of getting a handle on GDPR, is knowing where that sensitive data resides. Then you can make decisions on, okay, do we have enough data that we need to bring in a consultant to help us sort this out? Or do we need to buy a tool that's going to help us log and demonstrate compliance? But taking the first step really is to identify where that sensitive data resides. And again, Test Data Manager from CA has that capability. And we're focused primarily in testing, but that product can review any database and find the PII data.
Sure. And Jeff, like other compliance, schemas before, what companies are going to want, they're going to want their, certificate that says I'm GDPR compliant, I'm this compliant, that compliant. And there is no magic bullet. It's an ongoing, it's a consistent, constant type of thing. So that's another issue.
I think the important thing to point out too is that a lot of companies are, become paralyzed. They're like, well, we've only got 4 months until this, this legislation goes into effect. What do we do? The important thing is to get started. Okay. The important thing is to be moving towards compliance, because if you are identified by the European Union as having breached certain EU citizens' data, maybe you've come under review. The important thing is that you're moving towards compliance, that you've put processes in place, that you're able to demonstrate compliance and so on. That's far better than having done nothing if they should come knocking at your door to find out how you're doing. I think that what's going to happen is the EU will find a company to make an example of, possibly a company in North America even, where they're going to say, hey, we mean business with GDPR, and we're going to make an example of a company so that people are, pay attention and realize that they're serious about enforcing the regulation. So the best thing that companies can do is to start the journey and begin to demonstrate compliance. Start where you're at today and begin to move towards compliance. And like you said, Alan, it's an ongoing process.
Sure. And for those who say, oh my God, I sat on my hands for 2 years and I only have 4 months, that's too late. It's never too late, right? Starting is starting it, and we can move on from there. Jeff, another series of questions from Ruma in our audience is around the social media, right? I was recently at a lecture by a political analyst who said, look, if someone came back from 30 years ago and you had to explain to them what was the biggest change in the political landscape. It's social media, but it's not just politics, right? People get hired, fired, Me Too'd, and everything else today, right? By the use of social media. What about that sort of data? Because that's also ripe for hacking data, right? There's so much PII stored in our social media profiles and so forth. Clearly GDPR has to apply here.
Yeah, and you touch upon an important point around GDPR. If you have the time or the inclination to read the GDPR regulation in its entirety, you will see that there is some ambiguity in terms of what's considered private data and what is considered the use of that data and inappropriate use and so on. So things like social media, where certainly there is PII data stored there, and the companies that store that, be it Twitter, LinkedIn, or Facebook, or any of these companies, are going to have to pay very, very careful attention to GDPR and ensure the protection of that data. A company like Facebook will argue that they already are taking great care in managing personal user data and providing the capability for a user to specifically manage how that data is used and so on. But the regulation goes deeper than just being able to click a few boxes and say, I don't want this information public and this information is okay to make public and so on. But anyway, Facebook will argue that they are, moving in that direction, and I believe that they are. But the regulation still has ambiguities, and only over time and enforcement and probably a number of court cases will determine more specifically the jurisdiction and how data privacy is actually enforced.
Excellent. Hey, Jeff, got another question from the audience for you, if you don't mind. And this one's really right up your alley regarding testing and test data.
Yep.
So you mentioned that tech teams, or Rachel asked, you mentioned that tech teams will no longer be able to use real-life data to test their technologies. So how do companies overcome this? Where can they obtain compliant test data?
Right. So a good question. And a product like Test Data Manager from CA provides a capability to generate synthetic data, which is basically building data from scratch. So what I see happening with a lot of companies is right now when they're doing testing, they're using production data, they're masking that data, they're hiding the sensitive information, and they're using that for testing purposes. The problem or the challenge with that is they make multiple copies of that data. That consumes a lot of storage space and so on. But it also opens up an opportunity for greater breaches, or the possibility of more breaches to occur when that data is spread out. So GDPR says, hey, if you mask the data, that will help you meet compliance for GDPR. But a lot of companies are saying, you know what, we want to move away from creating or using production data altogether to just synthetically generating data so that we don't have any issue with this compliance initiative. And so I see companies beginning to move away from using production data because of the risks involved. Even if you're masking it, there's still risk involved. And obviously building synthetic data, there's no risk because it's all fake data, and you don't have to get anybody's permission to use it.
Sure, makes 100% sense. So, Jeff, another question, but it's really on a subject that we had in our pre-webinar kind of checklist, and that's around, and it comes from Ramsey, I should say. This is around the use of the same way if I'm US based and I don't really do business in the EU, but some of my third party customers do, or so I'm a supplier to others who do, GDPR applies to me. That chain of custody, if you will, applies behind me too. So I need to, if I have to be compliant to GDPR. My third-party solutions, SaaS solutions, for instance, right?
Yes.
Perfect example. They also need, right? And how do I ensure that they're GDPR compliant?
Yeah, it's like you said earlier, like PCI or any of these regulations also require that other third parties in that chain of business are, that they also be compliant. PCI compliance, for example, I as a business need to be PCI compliant, but I also want to ensure that my network provider or anybody that's carrying the sensitive data is also PCI compliant. So the same kind of principles are going to apply with GDPR. And I think that as bigger companies feel the pressure to be GDPR compliant, they're going to require that their suppliers also are GDPR compliant. So we'll have this trickle down kind of effect because the bigger company doesn't want to get fined, and they don't want to get fined because of their suppliers are not compliant. Now, as we know, companies like Walmart and obviously they have huge leverage in directing what their suppliers and vendors do in terms of every detail, product and pricing and even compliance initiatives. So I believe that what's going to happen is the same thing as these other regulations. Large companies will make sure that their suppliers are also can demonstrate GDPR compliance.
Yep. And so that rumor again brings it up from our audience, but it occurs to me too, Jeff. To me, this just screams out an opportunity for someone to make a buck saying, hey, maybe we don't certify you as GDPR compliant, but we've audited you and we give you our stamp of approval as being GDPR compliant, at least for today. Because otherwise, with PCI, I remember when it really started catching on. We used to get all of and it was the same spreadsheet. It was like 400 lines in an Excel spreadsheet that large companies were sending out to all their third-party providers, making sure they were PCI compliant and what they were doing, and they had to document that. Will we see similar GDPR?
Yeah, I definitely believe that will be the case because you have situation where the large companies are going to be required to demonstrate compliance. A company like Yahoo or any of these large companies that we know store lots of PII data are going to have to demonstrate compliance in a much bigger way in terms of hiring auditors and having reports done and so on. There is no GDPR stamp as of yet, what determines complete GDPR compliance. It will get to that point where there will be a specific list. As you go down to smaller companies, medium-sized companies, smaller companies, it will be the same situation where they will self-audit, they will demonstrate compliance. Perhaps it's through an annual checklist where they fill out some forms and submit those forms. I can see that eventually it will reach that point, similar to PCI. PCI is a little bit different in that, again, banks enforce PCI compliance. They have a vested interest, and they do it on the number of transactions that a company processes. So based on, they determine whether you're a very large risk to them or a small risk to them. GDPR is a little different in that the EU is attempting to protect EU citizens' data, personal information. And there is a financial risk associated with that as well, but it's more of a government entity trying to enforce that capability. But again, to answer your question, I think down the road, smaller companies will self-audit, larger companies will have to demonstrate greater degrees of compliance to GDPR.
Great. Jeff, another very, though GDPR is a data security regulation, it obviously has major impact and follow through to our developer communities, to our QA test communities, our ops, excuse me, and DevOps. Here's a specific question again for test data. So if you've already been using mass data from customers, let's say from 2015 as test data, and now that customer says, hey, I don't want my data used, delete me. It's incumbent upon companies to go and delete that from their test environment as well, correct?
Yes. Yeah, good question. Because, when GDPR is enabled, like I said before, it's going to give more broad rights to EU citizens. A lot of the population will say GDPR what? You'll have a smaller part of the population that'll say, I understand the situation and I don't want my data used for any purpose, and I want you to remove it. It's going to put companies in a difficult spot having to identify all of the instances of that personal data, be it on production servers or if that production data then got moved over to another server in its original form. Okay, now companies will argue and say, well, we have masked the data on our test servers and it's no longer identifiable. And that's, GDPR said, the regulation says, okay, but there's situations where when we've talked to a number of companies, a lot of the data that they've copied from production over to other environments either has not been fully masked, hasn't been masked at all. Some of the subsets of the data have been copied onto individual workstations and so on for testing purposes. So the idea that, we masked our data, we're good to go on a testing server may not necessarily be true, especially for large companies that are copying terabytes of data for testing purposes. It just is, it's a big risk for companies, and they know it, and companies are starting to wake up to that concern, especially in light of the recent breaches that we've heard about.
Excellent. So, Jeff, another question. So if you don't have an official stamp of approval, right? Right now we don't. One thing that we've seen companies starting to do is sort of bring in a data protection officer, right? This is akin to when the rise of the CISO. Now we'll see the rise of a chief data protection officer, a CDPO. And is that, make someone else's, butt on the line maybe, but is that an alternative?
Well, strategy? Sure. Every company is going to have to look at, again, the first step is really identifying how much PII data you have, especially as it pertains to EU citizens. But, larger companies certainly are already bringing in a person or a title called Chief Data Protection Officer or variations of that title. Smaller companies certainly aren't going to invest in that. It simply depends on the size of the company and the amount of data that you're concerned about. So again, the first step is really to assess at your company how many European citizens do we have, first of all, and what can we do to mitigate the challenge here? Do we move all the data to one location in the EU? Do we hire a data protection officer? Do we bring in a consultant to help us through this challenge? It's not one size fits all. Every company has to look at their own circumstances. I will say this, though. If you're looking at PII data, don't just look at EU citizens data. Look at all the PII data. This is an opportunity to strengthen your security posture. Don't look at it as yet another regulation. Look at it as an opportunity to become a better company with greater data privacy for all of your users, not just the EU.
And that's that getting away from that lowest common denominator security that I mentioned right in the beginning. You've taken us full circle. We're just about out of time, Jeff. Just one quick, Ramsey from the audience wanted to know, is there a special class that needs to be for employees of a company? So their PII, is it exempt from GDPR? I say no. You're still a person and your personal information is still your personal information. But do you know, Jeff, is there a separate class for employees?
No, I mean, GDPR doesn't distinguish between classes of, employee or non-employee. It is personal information, personal data, regardless. It could be that you're a customer or an employee of that company or a vendor doing business with that company. That is spelled out in the GDPR regulation. It's any EU citizen, their data is going to be protected. Doesn't matter whether you're an employee or a consumer, it's all the same.
Yep. So Jeff, I saved us 2-3 minutes here for a quick wrap up. And we still have a ton of questions we probably didn't get to from audience. I apologize, but we have records of them. Look, this thing's coming full speed ahead for May 25th. We're a little over 3-4 months out here. It's not too late to get on the bandwagon. It's not too late to make it happen, but certainly the time is now. We're not going to have any sort of magic bullet or stamp that says you're certified anytime soon. There will be plenty of people, I'm sure, offering solutions in spite of that. CA's Test Data Manager is a great tool for finding PII, which I think we all agree is the logical first step for GDPR compliance, is find out where your PII is within your environment. Where can people get more information about CA Test Data Manager?
Well, certainly if you go to ca.com and click on products, you can go to Test Data Management, and then under Test Data Management is Test Data Manager. Also, Alan, if you are interested in finding out more about GDPR, I would encourage our listeners to go to ca.com/GDPR. And we have built a site there with all kinds of information, videos, and so on that give you a lot of great information about GDPR. Let me just say one other thing as we wrap up about GDPR, because we had talked about giving our listeners some steps around GDPR. So let me just identify a couple of those steps. First of all, you mentioned you've got to discover where your PII data exists. That's the first thing. Secondly, once you discover it, identify how you're going to manage that data. Who's going to manage it? Is it bringing in extra people to manage the data or move the data to one location? So management would be that second pillar that I wanted to share. Third is protection. What kind of protections are you going to put in place once you begin to manage that data? And then fourth is reporting. How are you going to report the data and demonstrate compliance? Now again, TDM allows you to generate an audit report of all your sensitive PII data. So if you're looking for tools, find a tool that's going to help you also do reporting. So again, discover your data, manage your data, protect your data, and report on your data. Those are the four keys to getting a handle on GDPR.
DMPR.
There you go.
All right. Hey, Jeff, first of all, man, thank you so much for taking an hour out of your busy schedule to spend some time chatting with us. Thanks to CA for sponsoring today's discussion. I hope people found it relevant. I certainly did. And again, ca.com/GDPR is a great resource for people who are interested in this. Jeff, maybe we can have a further discussion closer to May as this thing becomes ready to become real, and we'll visit again.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to it.
Good. Until then, thanks for coming. Thanks for joining us. Thank you for joining us out there. This is Alan Shimel for DevOps.com and Security Boulevard. And thank you so much. And we hope we've answered some of your questions around GDPR. Good luck, everyone. And we'll see you soon on another webinar or on DevOps.com or Security Boulevard. Bye-bye, everyone.